I'm here with Dr. Peter Harmer, who's a professor in exercise and health science at Willamette University in Oregon. For 18 years, he was a sport medicine provider for USA Fencing, where he worked at 18 world championship competitions. For many years, he was the chief medical officer for USA Fencing. He's also been a senior research scientist at the Oregon Research Institute, where he does research on fall prevention, particularly in the elderly. It's great, Dr. Harmer, to speak with you today and to chat with you about the injury experience and how to help athletes get through it. Thanks for being with me.
All right, thanks, Les. I appreciate the invitation.
It would be interesting to hear more about your background and how you became interested in sport medicine as a field.
Yeah, so it's a long, tortuous journey. I was originally trained as an elementary school physical education teacher in Australia, working in the outback, but I was also a competitive athlete, played a number of sports while I was in college, but my primary sport was judo. I got injured when I was in high school that put me out for a long time. I had a dislocated shoulder, a fractured clavicle, a torn rotator cuff. So during the time that I was out, over the course of about a year and a half, several of my peers had gone on to succeed at a high level, national championships, making the national team. So then I got to thinking, if I hadn't been injured, what could I have done? So I ended up taking a leave from my teaching job and moved to Japan just to train. I ended up training at the Kodokan, which is the world headquarters of judo, and by a strange quirk, ended up also at the training at the Imperial Palace. That's a whole different story. But anyway, so 3 times a day, 6 days a week, training for what I thought was going to be 1 year. But that life was very attractive. I ended up staying there for 4 years. During that time, they had a big international competition called the Kano Cup, which was to celebrate the centenary of the establishment of judo as a sport. And I was training with the Australian team because I lived there and I knew the place. And one of our top athletes, probably the best, got injured. And there was no medical support with the team. So it's a high, national team at an international competition in a high-risk sport, no medical help. We ended up having to ask someone from the Dutch team, do you have someone who can help us? So after a couple of years, I had friends from Oregon when I was an undergraduate in Australia, had moved to go to graduate school at the University of Oregon. I followed them over there. When I got to America, I found out about athletic training as a profession. I said, that's what I want to do. I'm going to become a certified athletic trainer. I'm going to go back to Australia. I'm going to help athletes there. So I did that. I finished my first master's at Oregon, became a certified athletic trainer, moved back to Australia on and off for 2 years, but it couldn't work simply because the health practice laws in Australia were simply behind the times. They didn't allow me to do the kinds of things I could do in America. I got offered a fellowship to come back to Oregon to start a sports medicine program for their club sports and intramurals program, which is what I did. My judo career was going down, and my fencing career started going up. I started working with local fencing competitions and some of the national competitions. And again, national team at that time had no sports medicine providers, so I volunteered to work with the team at the World Championships in '89, which happened to be in Denver. That worked out quite well. I volunteered again in '90 for a competition for the World Championships in Hungary. And I was paying all of that myself. This is pro bono work to try and help the athletes. Eventually, they saw the value of what I brought to the table. Yeah. From 92 to 2000, all of my expenses were covered. I was a member of the team. and I went to all of those world championships. In 2000, I realized that the expertise that I brought to the table was perhaps getting a little stale. I had been developing people behind me to take over my position, had more specific expertise, particularly in chronic injury treatment. That's not one of my strengths, but that started to become a big issue with members on the team. So I had been developing people to stay in that position after I left. So in 2000, I thought, I feel good. The program's in good shape. I've got 3 or 4 assistants that have come through the program that are ready to take over. And then the Federation asked me to establish a national sports medicine program, which is what I did starting in 2000 to cover all of their national events. So that's 6 to 7 events a year, plus the national championships, which is the largest, still the largest fencing competition in the world. Have probably 10 to 12,000 people over 2 weeks.
Yeah,
we're working 16-hour days. I mean, it was tough. Yeah. But again, the program developed lots of support from certain people in the Federation. And so in that time, I was the chief medical officer for US Fencing. And at the same time, in 2000, the Federation asked me to stand for the medical commission of the International Fencing Federation, which is what I did. I got elected and I served 4 4-year terms. I was 16 years on that commission and the medical supervisor for 13 world championships during that time, as well as for the Asian Games in 06 in Qatar and the Pan American Games in 15 in Montreal. So yeah, that's kind of where I am.
Right. You've had a ton of international experience in the world of fencing. And how did you get involved in fencing?
Actually, when I was an undergraduate in Australia, one of my professors was a high-level fencer. We were interested in doing lots of different things. You know, as I said, I played collegiate, and collegiate sport in Australia is a little different in America. You can do multiple ones. So I played basketball and rugby and hockey, and you know, we were learning different things. So he started offering a fencing class because that's what he loved, and I took it, and it was really interesting, and I quite enjoyed it. But again, I didn't pursue it after I finished my undergraduate in Australia because I was a competitive judo athlete. So it was only after I got to Oregon to do my master's degree that I started picking it up again. I actually got an assistantship to cover my expenses for graduate school by teaching in their activities program. So I taught fencing and judo and table tennis, and you know, it all works really well. It was great.
Yeah. Your sporting background helped cover your education.
Pretty much, yes. Yeah. Well, I think we're lucky in our field that there are a lot of assistantships, whether it's a research assistantship, teaching, or you know, activities. It's like it works fine. Yeah. And so, you know, as my fencing career went down, my judo career, I started competing more and more, and so that became the focus of my competitive life.
Right. And you alluded to some of the kinds of chronic issues or injuries that may happen in fencing. Maybe you can elaborate on that a bit more.
Yeah. So we'll come back, I hope, but you know, primarily, I mean, there's been a big stigma about fencing in the public at large. People perceive it as a very dangerous sport. You know, obviously, hey, people are trying to hit each other with swords. And the only time we usually got much publicity was in those instances where events occurred that reinforced that public mythology. You know, Vladimir Smirnov got killed at the World Championships in Rome in '82 when a blade broke and went through his mask and penetrated his brain. So we have those kinds of things happen, and that reinforces this prejudice. But in fact, it's extraordinarily safe sport. Just as a sort of an aside, one of the things that I really spent a lot of time doing when I was working in these positions, both with the national team and on the International Federation stage, you know, I'm also a researcher, was to look at the data about injury risk and characteristics. I've published the 2 largest studies ever done on injury risk in competitive fencing in the world, one in the USA and one internationally. And my main focus was on acute injury. But the acute injury in fencing is the same stuff that we would see in any kind of dynamic stop-start sport, basketball, whatever. So it's mainly lower extremity, it's mainly ankles and knees, sprains and strains and, that kind of thing. We do have some lacerations and penetrations, but they're generally minor, and there are, maybe 2% of all reported time loss injuries across. I did 5 years of US studies with 80,000 participants. I did 5 years of international one with about the same number of participants. And the data are pretty stable across those variations. The US one was from kids from under 10 until veterans over 70. And the international one was, again, juniors, which are from like 14 up through the open division, Olympic Games and that kind of thing. So pretty stable. Anyway, so that's the stuff I was mostly dealing with, on strip type of things. But what I started to see is more, because as the training became more professional particularly through the late 80s and the 90s for the USA, we'd start to see more, lateral epicondylitis. We'd start to see more rotator cuff types of problems, plantar fasciitis. So those sorts of sort of chronic overuse types of thing, sort of idiopathic low back pain. So those were the things that were starting to be more problematic, particularly with the national team members.
Right.
And so that was tough, because we would only see them at world championships. Those things, they may be coming in with some of those problems, and trying to minimize their impact during the time that they're there, hopefully maybe giving them some ability to improve when they go home. Because again, a lot of the athletes didn't have necessarily a lot of people who are knowledgeable about these types of things. Again, one of the things that motivated me to develop the program and to be engaged at the international level, and particularly in bringing my colleagues along, giving them international experience. We got funding, so I'd have an assistant when I would go to the World Championships. That was a way of trying to help up-and-coming sports medicine people, certified athletic trainers, physical therapists, particularly dual-credentialed people, DPT and athletic training. I was very lucky to have a handful of those who came along to give them that international experience. Was because I got feedback from athletes who had been to the Olympic Games, and they're assigned an athletic trainer or something to, when they're at the Olympic Games. And the athletes were really frustrated because they were given nice people and competent people, but they knew nothing about the sport. They knew nothing about the kinds of injuries that the athletes would go through. I mean, they say, "Oh, well, fencing, it's really interesting. You guys really are athletes," or it was frustrating. And so again, I had one of the plans was to say, well, let's develop a pipeline of sports medicine professionals that ultimately can be go through the selection process at the USOC and make it onto the Pan American Games team, make it onto the Olympic Games team. So they're working with the fencers. They know the fencers and they know the sport. They're not unknown entities. And that's one of the things I was very happy with, that since 2000, I started the program in 2004, the bigger program. So in the 5 Olympic Games since then, one of the people who I developed or who came through my program have in fact been assigned as the sports medicine provider for fencing at the Olympic Games. So I've been very happy about that. They've done a very good job.
Well, it sounds, Peter, like you've been instrumental in really developing the profession, bringing the value of sport medicine providers to the sport of fencing. But I'm interested, you mentioned that there was kind of a change in the sport, or the sport became more professionalized. You mentioned from the 80s and 90s into the 2000s. By that, do you mean that the volume of training increased, or maybe you can clarify what you mean by how the sport became professionalized, and then how that related to your observation that chronic injuries were becoming more prevalent?
Yeah. So, the part of the problem is that fencing in the United States, it's not a widely known or popular sport. It wasn't, widely known or popular sport. When I started working with the national team, we were kind of like a third tier nation. I mean, you look at France and Germany and Russia and Italy, those athletes on their national fencing team, they're national sports stars. They're supported by the government. I mean, it's amazing. Italy travels with its own chef. Germany is sponsored by Mercedes-Benz. Wherever they go, the local Mercedes guy comes and ferries them around. US, we're traveling on trains and buses, and it was hard because there isn't any real support. There wasn't any real support for the sport in this country. The athletes were talented, hardworking, but you still have to have your job as a banker or a teacher, or you're a student or whatever else. I mean, it really was in that sense the amateur, right? I mean, you're trying to make do. People had to find their own money to go to the World Championships, sometimes subsidize it. The federation supported some, but anyway, it was hard going. But there have been sort of several pivot points over that sort of late 80s, early 90s, where we've always had some very good coaches, but there were some like really pivotal coaches who came onto the scene. Probably the first, so there are three that I think of as really being pivotal. So the first to me was Bucky Leach, and Bucky actually just got killed about a month ago. He was killed in a motorcycle accident, a tragic loss for the US, but he was kind of one of the first, started a club with kids with an aim of developing them from the bottom up. He and Nat Goodhart started a club up in Rochester, New York. Had no history. They just started from scratch, and they built an extraordinary club, very successful. The first world championship, junior world championship, came out of that club with Iris Zimmerman. So that kind of mindset changed, and people started building on that, starting to see that more structured training, more scientific approach is going to build, and really looking to develop something that only a few people early on did. So back in the 80s, Carl Borak and a few people, Carl, who was a multiple Olympian for USA, he was going by himself to Junior World Cups in Europe. We weren't sending people really to those competitions consistently. It wasn't something, maybe Junior World Championships, but not consistently the developmental stuff. And, Bucky and a few people like that started going, you know what? We're going to send kids over there when they're, 14 and 15 years old. So they get to understand what it's like to compete against kids who are coming from countries with programs that are huge, big government support, lots of sponsorship. And so that was sort of a starting point. And that trend was picked up in the late 90s with Ed Corfonti developing a women's Saber program at Oregon Fencing Alliance, which is where, again, became a focal point. Mariel Zagunis, five-time Olympian, two-time gold medalist in the Olympics in women's Saber, came out of that program. And so other people started to see we can do this, and they're making international connections, and the kids are starting to have, national camps and are bringing in international teams, and they're going over to Europe to do training with, national team camps and so forth. So all of those things started to really gel and change the mindset. And so you started seeing, again, the kids coming, not, they don't go to the club, 2 times a week and fence for a couple of hours. They're doing 2 and 3 and 4 hours a day at their club, 5-6 days a week, and they're going to international competitions on the weekend. And for the US, it was hard. I mean, you think about someone who wants to go to a junior World Cup, they would fly out on Thursday, arrive in Germany, France, Russia on Friday. They would fence on Saturday, they'd come home on Sunday and go to school on Monday. I mean, if you do that, you might do that 2 or 3 or 4 or 6 times a year. So, and just that, starts to travel. Anyway, the short version, I'm sorry, that long story is that with those changes, with Bucky, with Ed, with Arkady Burdan down in Atlanta. I mean, there are a lot of people I'm missing out, but these all built on that. When I first started with the team, if we had one person who made the top 64, it's like, hey, one person. If the US now doesn't win 5 gold medals at a world championships, it's a disaster. We are number one. We are one of the top countries in the world and have been for a decade at least or more. We're no longer the also-ran. We are a leader in that sphere. And that's happened, I mean, in an extraordinarily short period of time. I mean,
right.
25, 30 years to go from this to this. And along with that, of course, you've got many more kids coming in, more people being involved, more resources being involved, people who, coaches who are full-time, professional coaches now, kids who are giving over their focus to being an elite level athlete through fencing. Yeah. And just as an aside, it's interesting, the USA has also been the leader in gender equity in fencing. Primarily, there are 3 weapons, 3 events, foil, epee, and saber. When I first started, those 3 events for men and only foil for women. In late 80s, early 90s, USA was a leader in getting epee approved as a separate event for women. And in the late 90s, getting saber approved as an elite weapon for women. Mm-hmm. It's not just been maintaining the status quo, it's opening up vistas for new athletes to come in. And apropos what we're just talking about, I'll give you an example. When I did my study with time loss injuries in fencing, the national one, the number one most at-risk group was women saber fencers. Right. They had a much higher risk of a time loss injury than any other of the groups. And part of that, I can't say definitive, but from my research, part of that was because at that time, women were primarily converting from one of the other disciplines to become saber fencers. There were very few women, young girls coming through that time who started as saber fencers and built up. So when the opportunities for women's saber became open, you had some people who were coming in, maybe starting up. A lot of them were converting from foil primarily. But saber it's the most dynamic of the 3 weapons. I mean, it's boom, done. I mean, it's ballistic. And so the kind of forces, the stresses that are placed are very different from what you use from foil or epee. The rate of attacks is, you make an attack, it's fast, but the rate of the bout is so different. And so I think, and so the kinds of injuries that I was seeing, these acute musculoskeletal injuries, particularly in that group, I think was a result of the fact that it was so new and that the people who were coming in really hadn't been conditioned for the demands. that was reflected, I think, when I did the international study, looking at international competitions, which I did about 10 years later. I think I published that maybe 2 or 3 years ago. By that time, women's saber had become very well established. You're having athletes who are coming into the sport as a saber fencer, learning it from being 8, 9, 10, 12 years old, and in that international study, there is, women's saber is not an outlier.
Yeah. So as you're seeing kind of these changes where women have been increasingly participating in the saber, you're saying that there are not gender differences in injury rates.
Right. It's not the outlier that it was when I did the first study, when women's saber was really sort of just becoming established as an opportunity to compete internationally, for example, for a world championship and so forth.
Right. Yeah. So I guess those findings would kind of be consistent with your explanation that maybe there was something about going from the épée or foil, which was less demanding, into the saber.
Well, I'm sorry, it's not, those aren't less demanding events, but they're demanding in different ways.
Okay.
So the kinds of stresses, the kinds of forces that are applied to your body are very different. So, for example, épée, because of the nature of the weapon, is a kind of much more tactical weapon, and the bouts go full length. So a fencing bout, it used to be, they've changed the rules, but the short version is, a bout in the direct elimination is 3 minutes.
Yeah.
Of fencing action. It stops for various reasons. In épée, they virtually would use up the whole 3 minutes, right? You're looking for an opening. There's a lot of strategy and tactical specific advantage sort of stresses. And so you've got to be very, very careful about how you time your attack. And so there's a lot of that. But when they make an attack, it's fast.
Right.
But saber is not like that. Saber, I actually did a study at a world championship. Saber bouts, they can be over in 30 seconds. I mean, you're going for five touches in the direct elimination and 15 touches. 5 touches in the preliminary in the pools, 15 touches, 3-minute rounds, 15 touches in a direct elimination. Foil and épée usually go into the second or third period. Saber is so fast that the rule is they change after, they have a break after 8 touches. They go 2 minutes. I mean, it's like, boom, done, 1 point, boom, done, 1 point. Whereas the other 2 weapons, it's like there's a lot of action, there's a lot of physicality, but it's a very different type of demand, So they're not easier or different. They're just different in the way those demands are applied.
You're right. And so I didn't mean to suggest that, one, form is less demanding, but it sounds like they're just different demands.
Right. It would be like saying, what's the difference between a 100-meter runner and a 1,500-meter runner?
Sure.
Right. So it's that kind of differences in demand on cardiovascular system, demands on musculoskeletal development, that kind of thing.
Sure. So do you notice, once athletes experience a chronic versus an acute injury, do the kinds of concerns or apprehensions that they have, do they differ as a function of whether they have an acute injury or, and maybe, I guess speaking to your clinical experience and asking that question?
Yeah, it depends. It can be, I think the difference is how long the athlete gets to stew on their predicament. Right? Yeah. So in an acute circumstance, it can be frustrating. Obviously, depends on what are the circumstances in which the injury occurs and how is that going to impact their goal for being able to compete. So, for example, I was working with an athlete. We were at the World Championships in Hungary, I think, in 90. 90 or 91. And she was a two-time Olympian. She'd been warming up, preparing for her bout, which is going to be, 10 minutes away, did a movement, had a shoulder pain. And she was distraught. It's like really painful, couldn't move her arm. I mean, here she's supposed to go on, for a world championship, and just really, it was very, very hard. And I had to sort of, technique, I'm not sure it's a great technique, but really to try and bring her back to the moment. I hold her face and I get her look at me, listen to me, take a deep breath, hold it.
Yeah.
Let it out. Do it again. I mean, the first thing you've got to do is get past that initial frantic response because of circumstance.
Right.
And I did the evaluation on her, and as it turned out, it was an unfortunate one. It looked like it was a strain up in her shoulder, rotator cuff, something or other, and we kind of got it through it. It turned out to be actually a big problem. It was a labral tear, which she had to get repaired when she got back. But the point there is, if you have a circumstance and there's lots of pressure, as you know, and I'm sure it's been alluded to before, that the way the athlete responds is very different. I had another athlete at an Olympic it was the Olympic trials for the World Championships. Olympic trials for the national team, I think for maybe in '84 when I first started working out. But I was there, and the athlete made a move and ruptured his Achilles tendon.
Ooh.
No chance. I mean, you're done. I'm sorry, it's over. And this guy just wouldn't accept it. You don't know what you're talking about. You're not qualified. I'm fine. You're a quack. And I'm saying this, okay. And there was a point at which it didn't matter what you said. This guy wasn't going to. So I said, okay, stand up and do it.
Yeah.
And of course he couldn't. He stood up and he fell down. I mean, Sometimes there isn't any way you can explain it to them or calm them down. You just go, okay, do it. And that was a different. So, but if it's, we have, contusions and sprains, and you tape them up and they're fine, and that's not a big deal.
Yeah.
But the chronic ones, again, it depends on how chronic it is and how much is it interfering with what they want to do.
Right.
And, it runs the gamut. You have epicondylitis that we can treat conservatively and keep it under control, and the athlete's able to keep going. You might have to say, you're going to have to modify your training. Focus on your foot. Let's say it's lateral epicondylitis. That's kind of common. Okay, focus on your footwork. You're not going to be able to do as much work with your weapon as with your blade work as normal. Or, you're going to have to break your training program up into smaller segments. So you might still do an hour's work, but you're not going to do an hour consistently. You're going to do 10 minutes and then take a 5-minute break, and then 10 minutes. And you're trying to figure out, how do I minimize the demand on the structure so that it's not going to be aggravated, so you can get it under control, hopefully so you resolve it without unduly having them lose conditioning, right? So the trick there is, of course, you're trying to maintain as high a level of function as you can while minimizing the demand on the body part that is problematic.
Yeah.
And in those situations, it's really hard. Sorts of things that the specialists in applied sports psych use. You're thinking about goal setting. Okay, here is the problem. Okay, you can't say, I'm going to the Olympic Games, right? And I've got this problem. No, you've got to say, here is my goal for 2 weeks from now, that I'm going to be able to do this thing better than I'm doing it right at the moment, given the kind of restriction I have. Yeah. And then after I achieve that, and again, I'm saying 2 weeks, I rarely talk with athletes about time. What I talk with athletes about is function. When you get to this level, then we do this.
Well,
And then when you get to this level, because one of the things that can happen if you say, it's 2 weeks and it gets to 2 weeks and the thing that you said would change hasn't changed,
right.
then your credibility sort of takes a hit, So you've got to be very careful then about, you might say, typically it might be about this long. So they know kind of it's not disappearing indeterminately into the future.
Right.
But you've also got to be very careful that they don't take it literally.
Yeah.
And when you get to that time point and they haven't achieved it, they go, well, you don't know what you're doing. So that's always a really tricky path to tread in a practical sense.
Right. Well, I was going to ask about that because, I know for many athletes, probably the first question is how long am I out for, or how long till I get back? And so, but you mentioned you prefer not to give specific time points.
I might have to do that, but it's with lots of caveats. It's never a hard date. And again, it depends on the individual. And that's one of the nice things, one of the good things that I have seen come out of my program. What I wanted was for the athletes to know the sports medicine stuff, for the sports medicine staff to know the athletes.
Right.
When I first started doing this with the national team, unless they were kind of local to me, I might not see them except at the World Championship. And I might know them in passing. I don't know them, and I don't necessarily know all the things that they've been done and doing. But when I started building the national program with the same people providing care, you're going to see these athletes at the national events, and you're going to get to know them well, and you're going to get to know their problem. And they're going to get to know you, and they're going to have a much greater rapport, a much greater, perhaps, confidence in those people that they have seen and who have helped them. Hopefully, at an event where they've had some minor problem, and then the sports medicine staff has been able to help them, and that, with that minor problem. So if they're faced with a major problem, then you've got an affinity that really helps move forward, because now when you say, here is what you should do, here are the approaches that you can make, the athlete says, okay, I trust you.
Right.
And then the sports medicine staff is making these recommendations in light of what they understand about this particular athlete. And talking to the athlete support network, to their coach, to perhaps to their parents, to their teammates. You're trying to build a framework within. It's not just the athlete trying to deal with this problem on his or her own. Right? These things are part of an environment that has lots of different inputs. I was going to ask you. I kind of wandered off the point there.
No,
do you understand what I'm trying to say here is that getting to know the athlete, like in any clinical setting, you're more likely to be effective if you know your client than if you don't. It doesn't mean you can't be effective if you're working with somebody you don't know, but under these circumstances, the probability of being able to produce really good care and have really good results, part of that is having these relationships that you develop over time.
Right. And I wanted to just pick up on that point that you mentioned, Peter, about the athlete having confidence in you, the sport medicine practitioner, and the implications of that. And you started to speak to that, but maybe you can pick up on that point. Why is it important, I guess, for the athlete to be confident in you, the provider? What are the benefits or implications of that?
Well, I think the fundamental one is if they're not confident in you, they're not going to do what you tell them to do. And
sure.
In one sense, because of that resistance, they may end up cutting off their nose to spite their face. If it's somebody, and, you try to be open, but, not all personalities clash. I mean, not all personalities gel. There can be clashes. And I do this. I can be really stubborn, and I don't like to go to somebody I don't like.
Yeah.
for help. I mean, I'm just not going to do it. You know,
Right.
even if it would benefit me, I say no. I'm not interested.
Right.
So I think that's the main thing. I think the other part that's really important is that if you have that confidence, if you have that trust, even well-designed treatment programs, rehab programs, particularly long-term rehab programs, and we're not necessarily involved with those obviously on a day-to-day basis. That's going to happen with somebody else. But even if you have a well-designed treatment rehab program, they don't all go smoothly. There are going to be challenges and setbacks and so forth. And so if you don't have the athlete's trust, when you come to those kinds of challenges, the probability that then the athlete stops goes up. But if you've got that trust, if you've got that relationship and say, here's what we're planning, here's where I expect it to go, and it doesn't go that way, then you've got a framework for dialogue with the athlete to say, yeah, look, it's a setback, we know that, but here's how we can deal with it, and here's how we move forward. And then, you know, again, just like at the beginning, you've got somebody who says, yeah, okay, I get it. I'll continue to work on that.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
and
so when they have that confidence and trust in you, then it facilitates dialogue or communication about what's happening with their recovery, what amendments need to be made, that kind of thing.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Would you say to what extent is it important for the individual athlete to have the belief that you as a practitioner believe in their abilities?
Oh yeah, I think that's very straightforward. If they think you're just spouting stuff, again, you're back to, okay, why should I listen to you? You know, why should I do what you say? And that's the thing that's developed, I think, you know, across healthcare in general. When you look at the change in the MCATs, right, the way that medical schools are looking at who they're willing to accept as providers, part of that was driven by sort of a gradual evolution of healthcare providers, physicians particularly, but can happen to other people, looking at their patients as technical problems, right? You're an ACL rupture, right? You're an ankle sprain. You're a case of colon cancer. You're not. I don't connect you as a person. You know, you're simply a technical problem. I'm a professional. I'm paid to try and fix you.
Yeah.
And we know that healthcare wellness is more global. It's not simply physical. I mean, the very fact that the profession that you're in, I mean, we know that the psychology of wellness is a major contributor. You know, perseverance, for God's sake. You know, if you're faced with an ACL reconstruction and you're going to be out for 6 months or 9 months, if you don't have some level of mental fortitude, your chances of surviving, I mean, of, you know, being successful are not great.
Yeah.
So again, I think that trust comes back to, if there isn't really a commitment, an empathy of the healthcare provider with the athlete might respect your technical expertise, but you need more than that, particularly in circumstances that are challenging and ongoing. There's got to be, I think, a personal connection there. And so the athlete's belief in you, believing in them, is a critical part of that.
Yeah. And you know, you mentioned the importance of just getting to know the athletes or being able to spend time. Are there other elements, I guess, that are important in terms of building rapport or trust with the athlete, or how does one go about doing that?
Yeah, you know, I mean, a lot of it's sort of day-to-day, you know, interactions, not just seeing them and talking to them when they've got a problem. You know, when you're at World Championships or some of the national stuff, you know, there are lots of chances to interact and so forth. But the other thing you have to do is, in essence, not put yourself in a situation where you're going to potentially compromise that relationship. So I've made a lot of mistakes in my professional career of varying types. But there was an instance in particular that speaks to this. So when you go away to world championships, you've got a team captain and a manager, and you've got the coaches, and you've got the sports medicine staff, you've got the armorers, the people who take care of the equipment. You've got a cadre of people that are there. And, as we know, unfortunately, athletes are people, and sometimes they do things that they shouldn't do, things that contravene team rules and for which there are adjudications and consequences. So we were at a world championship. There was an incident. The team captain said, we need to form a disciplinary panel. And they asked me to be on it as being kind of a, what's the word I want?
Like an
unaffiliated, unaffiliated individual. And I was, again, I want to be a team member. I mean, I want to help, the team in this. So I said, sure. And that was a major mistake. That was a major mistake, because even though I was trying to act objectively and I'm following the rules and the direction of the team leader, when I went on that disciplinary panel, there were a bunch of athletes that automatically said, no, clearly, you're an officious official. I mean, it was very, very hard for me. Yeah. And there were some athletes, it didn't matter how good my relationship was before them. And they weren't even the ones under investigation. I mean, they weren't the ones who were visible. But as soon as I moved to try and do that thing, that just undermined my relationship with a lot of the athletes that I'd worked really hard to build. And once that's gone, that's very, very hard to get back. So, it's one of those things in the larger sense. Yeah, I'll do this. And I should have just said, no, that's I'm not comfortable with that. It's likely to affect X, Y, and Z. But at that time, you're saying, well, no, that's something that's important for the team, and we need to be able to do this. And it was a major error on my part in terms of my relationship with those athletes.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in hindsight, it's hard to know sometimes, right? That there were probably unintended consequences. I imagine that wasn't your aim, but
no, of course not. No. It was to provide, again, trying to be an impartial adjudicator, and it was like, no, forget it, mistake.
Yeah. So I'm interested, Peter, in how decisions are made about when athletes are ready to return. And I guess ready could be in the broad sense of physical or even kind of mentally ready. And I'm just thinking about the example you gave earlier of the athlete who was panicking, and it turns out they tore their labrum, and yet it sounded like they still went out and competed and then had it fixed afterwards, or was that the circumstance?
Yeah, it didn't go well. She was very, very limited, and she got through it, but it wasn't a good situation. I did a real kind of sort of the best patch up job that I could do on the spur of the moment, and it was kind of enough so that she wasn't completely incapacitated, but it was not something that I could fix there. I mean, she had to have a repair done when she got back to America.
So in that instance, just as an example, like how was the decision? I guess obviously there's some clinical assessment about what her capabilities are. How is the decision made? Well, you can go and compete.
Yeah. So, that's in any circumstance, like an acute circumstance, you're going to run through a gradated series of increasing stresses, right? So let's do an ankle, because that's a pretty straightforward one. They sprain their ankle, you come in and say, yeah, it looks like you've got a 1+ or a grade 2 ankle sprain, lateral ankle sprain. Okay, we're going to tape it up because that's a standard sort of prophylactic thing. Okay, so now, is it good enough? All right, so I would run through a series of things. Okay, can you walk on it? Okay, can you hop on it? Right now, can you advance and retreat on it. Okay, now do it faster. Now do it faster. Okay, now do a lunge. All right, now do a lunge and recover. Okay, so you start to try to conservatively move the marker piece by piece, and you start to see, okay, how much can they tolerate? And if it's reasonable, you would say, okay, I don't see this being aggravated by you now going back into the competition, right? Now, and so, you're not going to make decisions that would place the athlete, I would say, as a general rule,
right?
I'm not going to place the athletes at risk in a competition. But the truth is that marker is not static.
Sure.
The decision I would make to try to say to an athlete, you're done, is very different if I'm working with a 12-year-old at a local competition than I'm working with an elite level athlete. And I'll give you an example of this. So I was working at World Championships, ended up, because, all our athletes and coaches are friends with athletes and coaches from other countries. And so I got asked to come and look at, it was a team competition, men's foil championship, gold medal bout. And I was asked to come and look at the athletes, 2 of the 3 athletes from this one of the teams that was going to be in this gold medal bout. And both of them had very serious injuries. I mean, in the sense of one had a very significant quad strain on the front leg, which absorbs takes a lot of stress in the kind of back and forth type of thing that you do. Very difficult. You could barely walk. And the other one had a very severe ankle sprain on his back leg. And the ankle on your back leg, because of the way the foot is placed in order to move, takes much, much more stress than the ankle on the front leg. And again, could barely. And I said to both of these guys, look, this is really, you guys, I mean, you can barely stand up. This is my advice is you can't do this, right? It's going to be potentially, you're going to end up with some really worse things. And they went, it's the gold medal at the World Championships. Of course we're going to do it.
Yeah.
And all I could do then is do the best I could to protect them. I mean, my best major prophylactic taping and bracing and reinforcing and everything. And they actually ended up winning. Now, that it wasn't my brilliant care. They obviously then their coach had to come up with some tactical changes given the limitations that they had physically. But, psychologically, these guys were extraordinarily strong. I mean, the ability to say, I can hardly stand, I'm going to put that out of my mind. I'm going to focus on exactly this. This is the tactic that we're going to employ now, given that I can't do what I normally do.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that came out. But the thing I learned from this, and that I'd known and I'd practiced a little bit, was exactly that. There's not like, here is the threshold for saying an athlete can go on. That threshold is different. It's different maybe for the same athlete at a different time in the season, maybe more conservative at the beginning of the season than you are if you're at the World Championships. I'm going to be more conservative with a young athlete, in a local thing than I might be with an older athlete somewhere else, and explaining that, children, of course, are a whole different situation because you've got to involve parents and, getting that kind of thing going on. But you get the general picture.
Yeah.
So that's fresh. And again, part of that is knowing the athletes, knowing their goals. I mean, I didn't know these athletes, but I personally, but I knew of their abilities. They'd been high-level athletes before, and for them to come along and say, in one sense, it's like, appreciate your input, but forget it. This is what we're going to do. And then you're left with, okay, I've given them my best advice. they're not taking it, what can I do now in order to facilitate what they're going to do and hopefully minimize any particular complications of the problem that they had going forward. So,
yeah, I guess in short, it's quite complicated and multifaceted in terms of these decisions and, relative to the athletes, as you say, their age, their career stage, the proximity of a competition or whether they're in a competition, those kinds of considerations. So you alluded to this example of the athlete who, you fixed up and despite his impairment went and won the competition. And so I'm wondering, this is kind of a broad question, are there factors, and they could be psychological, that you've witnessed in your clinical work or maybe physical things that kind of distinguish the athlete that is able to overcome an injury, either chronic or acute, versus those who seem to maybe take more of a downward trajectory after an injury, and maybe it causes them to cease their participation or maybe to return, but in a weakened capacity. Are there like distinguishable factors that you might say that can account for the path that an athlete takes after injury?
Because that's not, it's more your area than mine. I mean, it's really about resilience. It's about a level of psychological strength to understand that this can be a hard road to hoe. When I think about differences, it's interesting because I've seen people who are really sort of exuberant, joie de vivre, positive personalities and so forth, who have done this really well, and some who are like that who don't. That sort of their innate personality doesn't allow them to do that. And I've run across the complete opposite, those who are sort of Eeyore type people, dour and sort of looking pessimistic, but they've found the mechanism to go forward, and some who don't. I don't have a really good sense of, I can say this is the kind of person only that they would have this attribute. I think somebody who's able to, in one sense, compartmentalize and prioritize are going to do really well. They say, here is this injury, which is part of what I'm doing, and it's not going well, and I'm going to figure out how to move this forward. So in essence, there's a level of acceptance and then a problem-solving mindset that allows them to go forward. The ones that are the most problematic, and I think this is pretty common, this is not a great insight, where the athlete feels the injury is its own entity. Injury is its own entity. In essence, the injury has control of the athlete's life. I have this injury and I can't do anything about it. Right? That's the biggest danger, because as soon as the athlete feels that he or she has no control over it, then trying to motivate them to deal with it is really a chore, because they just don't believe that they can.
Right.
And that you can work people past it depending upon how significant the injury is and what kind of people that they are. But that's the one where they have a sense of a loss of control. But long-term rehab, maybe they get separated from their teammates. That's a really important thing, as is injured athletes stay connected to their teammate, even if it's coming in and being on the sidelines while the team is working out and you're doing your rehab, or maybe you're helping with the scoring, or maybe you're doing something else, but you're staying connected. Is really, really important. But as soon as you have a sense of loss of control and you become isolated from the environment, it's a downward spiral that can be really, really hard to bring people back from. So I think, helping them understand that, that there are ways people have been in this situation before, and here's how they've moved forward, and here are the steps we can take, and laying it out. So if they've had the ability to compartmentalize, then prioritize, then I think you've got a chance to go forward. But if you've got people who, in essence, it's a disaster and there's no way that they can see their way past this disaster, that's very, very, very difficult to work with. And again, that's sorry. And that's where I would say, okay, recommend them, refer them on to a applied sports psych specialist, somebody who has the specific training to deal with particularly those very difficult cases, ones where there can be a great resistance to seeing that you can make this recovery.
Right. I guess in the language in sports medicine terms, would this idea of functional progressions help the athlete to be able to compartmentalize and prioritize? This is where I'm at. These are the steps I need to take. Would those progressions be important in fostering a sense of control, or is that?
Yeah. But the thing is, you've got to get them buying into it, right? That's the trick. I mean, that's exactly the way you would do that. And I use examples like when you first started, right? When you first started this sport, you were not at this level. Right? You did this and you did this and you did this and you did this and you got there. Why do you think you can't do it again? Right? You do this and you do this and you do this and you do this. So, you can use sort of their past experience, a very straightforward one. Nobody's born, walk straight onto the Olympic team the first time they pick up, they try to learn something. Right. So, if you try to engage them, that way, which is part of what that functional thing is, those are some of the strategies absolutely that you can use. Yeah. But if there's no hook in the beginning, then that's what you've got to find. We talk about, the longest journey starts with a single step. Sure. Well, what is it that makes the person take that first step? Yeah. And that's the thing. And once you can get the ball rolling, great. You can build on that in appropriate increments. And again, that's got to be part of knowing the athlete, which is where, high school athletic trainers or collegiate sports medicine staff, that's why they do really well. Yeah. Because they know these people pretty well. Yeah. And so when there are tough situations, you're really got a head start on doing this. And well, I can maybe do a bit of tough love with this person, or no, I need to massage this person's sort of mindset a little bit to get them to take that first step, and then we can continue on from there.
Right. So again, that sort of rapport, or that knowledge, can help you tailor and individualize how to help them take those first steps, or to see the light at the end of the tunnel, I guess, so to speak. And those are great comments, Peter. And I appreciate your time in speaking. And it's a real pleasure to just hear about your experiences and then the work that you've done, and to benefit from your knowledge. So I appreciate the time. It's great to speak with you.
Thank you. Let me just say one short thing. I know we're running out of time. One of the things that I've always wondered, is particularly with applied sports psychology, I know there's been a lot of research done on resilience and so forth, and it's really something that needs to be investigated further. What makes what we might think of super resilient athletes in terms of injury. And I'll tell you, okay, so when I was doing my international study, came across an athlete, female, who had an ACL injury. She was out for 7, 8, 9 months. That was the initial thing. There was a complication from the surgery. She had to have 2 more surgeries. She was out for another 2 years. She came back. She tore the repair, had to have another surgery. So basically, I had like a 3-year gap between when I first had her and when she showed up again. And when I contacted her because I needed to get some information, it's like, my God, I would have just like, forget this, I'm going to take up sailing. I mean,
Right.
And, trying to, as you say, find what is it that gives that person that level of perseverance, bottling that would make all our lives so much easier. So,
Yeah. No, I mean, of course, these are, complex issues, right? And I guess, and multifactorial, right? Like,
yes.
probably a function of the individual, maybe the characteristics they have before the injury, what their goals are in their sport, environmental characteristics, the support that they have from people like yourself, and who are they working with? Do they have access to the right kinds of environments to recover? But I think those are particularly interesting questions, and it's interesting when you see certain commonalities that emerge from different studies, right? Where athletes who tend to have successful recovery, however that's defined, they tend to listen and engage with their rehabilitation practitioners. They manage their pain, or they, as you say, they find ways to assert some form of influence or control, whereas maybe others say, oh, this is just too much of an open-ended problem and I can't see my way out of this, right? Like, so there do tend to be some of those consistencies, I think, that can be dissected. But
that what we see in general, that make me well mentality, as opposed to I'm responsible for my own well-being, and that's a big one to try and to develop.
Yeah. And in sports psychology, or in psychology, it's often referred to as locus of control. Like, do I see myself as the cause and originator of actions, and do my actions influence the outcomes, or is what happens to me in life just a product of external factors beyond my control? And that characteristic has been shown to predict different kinds of outcomes in rehab, for sure. But again, I could chat with you plenty more, Peter, but I certainly appreciate the opportunity to do so, and thanks for being on the podcast. It's a real pleasure.
Right, no problem. I appreciate the time, Les. Hopefully it was helpful.
It definitely was. It's great speaking with you.